In June 1971, a government worker named Daniel Ellsberg hit his breaking point. Ellsberg worked in the U.S. federal government for years. He had a history as a defense analyst for nuclear weapons strategy and counterinsurgency theory. In 1964, he was hired to work in the ISA as an analyst in South Vietnam. Additionally, Ellsberg had a positive history with the government, but his time in Vietnam changed his views. In June 1967, he returned to the U.S. to work at the Rand Corporation, but to his dismay, his doubts were confirmed. The U.S. government had been lying to the people, so, after several weeks of compiling information, he leaks it to the New York Times. The compilation of information he released would become known as the Pentagon Papers. The release of the Pentagon Papers was a constitutionally upholding act because it empowered the people's rights to an honest government and the press's responsibility to expose the truth, which holds our leaders accountable. But wait, how did we get here?
It's rewind time.
To understand why the US government had the papers in the first place and why there's so much backlash against them, you have to go back to the 1930s, when France controlled most of Indochina. After being under French control for almost 50 years, the Vietnamese wanted to be free from European rule. The French power in the area had been weakened from fighting World War I. This opened up an opportunity for the Vietnamese to take over. This was further pushed when World War II started and the French were conquered by Germany. It was now or never for the Vietnamese to take over their country once again. At the same time as World War II was going on, the USSR was beginning to make a name for themselves. They were emerging as a very powerful country. And as the USSR grew in power, so did communism.
Being polar opposites while also being the two most powerful countries in the world at the time, tension naturally began to arise between the two. This would lead to the Cold War. The idea of communism would enter Vietnam, and that would lead to the country being split in two. The North supported communism while the South opposed it. On November 1st, 1955, Northern Vietnam invaded Southern Vietnam. This prompted the United States to help aid the South and send troops to help, while the Soviet Union chose to help supply the North. This started the Vietnam War. As the Vietnam War progressed, Northern Vietnam was gaining more power and control over Southern Vietnam. Although the United States continued to help the South, it was unclear whether or not they were winning. The U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara began to grow concerned about the war, so he considered studying all of the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam up to that time. In June of 1967, this study began. This would be the origin of the Pentagon Papers.
The Pentagon Papers was a top-secret study that very few people knew about. One of the people involved was Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was one of the most involved people in the study and was a key part to finishing the Pentagon Papers. The entire Pentagon Papers took 18 months to complete and had 3,000 pages of dialogue and 4,000 pages of documents. Since Ellsberg was one of the few people who had seen the full documents, he knew that staying in the war wasn't a good call. Early on, he was an avid supporter of American involvement in the Vietnam War, but by the end, he had become appalled to what he saw and decided he needed to do something about it. You may be wondering though, what was on the papers? When reading the papers, Ellsberg discovered that every president had lied to the American people up to that point. They told the public that the United States was winning the war. But the reality was the United States was not winning the war. They were losing, very, very badly. Each president was too scared and afraid of the backlash to be the one to have lost the war, so they continued to send troops and spend billions of dollars on the war efforts. Reading this caused Ellsberg so much anger and distress that he knew he had to do something. Despite knowing all the risks he would take, he did it for the greater good. In October of 1969, Ellsberg and another colleague, Anthony Russo, secretly made copies of the documents and shared them with US senators who were against the war, hoping they could help him do something about it. To his shock, they simply turned him away, and Ellsberg realized he had to take matter into his own hands. 2 years later, in June of 1971, Ellsberg contacted the New York Times, and they published the first installment of the Pentagon Papers. Shortly after, Attorney General John Mitchell asked the New York Times to stop reporting on the Pentagon Papers, but they refused. This caused the federal district courts in Manhattan to issue a temporary restraining order. This was the first time since our country began that the federal government had attempted to stop a newspaper from publishing anything.
Because of the restraining order, the New York Times could no longer report on the Pentagon Papers. But this didn't stop Ellsberg though. He decided to go to the Washington Post, where they printed the papers. But the Nixon administration quickly shut them down too. Luckily, many other stations picked up the story and continued reporting on it. With all the attention being drawn to these cases, the Washington Post and the New York Times were able to appear before the Supreme Court very quickly. On June 28, 1971, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Times and Post in a 6-3 vote. Despite the happy ending for the New York Times and Post, it wasn't the case for everyone else. On June 26, 1971, only 2 days before the Supreme Court ruling, Daniel Ellsberg turned himself in. Finally being able to put a face to their problems, Daniel Ellsberg was nicknamed the most dangerous man in America. Daniel Ellsberg was tried in court, but his case was thrown out because one of the members of the Nixon administration broke into a psychiatrist's office. As a result, Ellsberg was set free, but the public was outraged by what the government had done. Why was Ellsberg prosecuted for publishing the papers? After all, the First Amendment grants the freedom of the press. The government had no right to shut down the printing of the papers, but they still did anyway. What's the point of the Constitution having amendments if the government can deny or limit them whenever it wants? Daniel Ellsberg once said, "Only we, the public, can force our representatives to reserve their abdication of the war powers that the Constitution gives exclusively to the Congress."
Consider the role of the press. The freedom of the press is protected in the First Amendment of our Constitution, a right that empowers journalists to hold those in power accountable. But with this freedom comes a responsibility to serve public interest, even in the face of opposition. When the government attempted to block the publication of the Pentagon Papers, citing national security concerns, the New York Times and the Washington Post stood firm. Their decision to publish was a testament to the press's role as a watchdog, ensuring that power is never wielded without public observation. Daniel Ellsberg himself explained his motivations in a 2008 interview with the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, stating, "Well, it was crucial. One of the crucial elements of my decision to do that was the understanding of where Nixon was in his Vietnam policy. This underscores the vital role of public awareness in holding the government accountable." In response to the Pentagon Papers publication, President Richard Nixon famously remarked,
"Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook."
Although this quote was not directly tied to the Pentagon Papers, it reflected the growing distrust in government, fueled by the revelations of deception and misconduct. By publishing the Pentagon Papers, the press fulfilled its duty to inform the public, defending the very freedoms that sustain our democracy. The Pentagon Papers empowered Americans by revealing the truth about a war that had lost countless lives and divided the nation. This knowledge sparked public debate, fueled protest, and ultimately pressured the government to change its course. By unveiling the truth, the publication of the Pentagon Papers reminded us that the power ultimately rests with the people, and we must wield it wisely. Now, some may argue that leaking classified information sets a dangerous precedent and jeopardizes national security, but let me be clear. The Pentagon Papers did not expose active military plans or endanger troops on the ground. Instead, they revealed a pattern of deception, one that reduced public trust. In this case, the public's right to know far outweighed any speculative risk. Democracy cannot function in the dark, and the Pentagon Papers brought a much-needed light to the critical issue. When Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, he bypassed the established channels for addressing concerns, such as reporting to Congress. Critics argue that this act risked undermining trust in the government's ability to protect confidential information, creating a pattern that could cause future leaks with more damaging consequences. Yet, while this critique is valid, we must ask why Ellsberg felt compelled to act as he did. His decision was a direct response to the government's failure to fulfill its responsibilities. When those in power betray the public's trust, it falls on individuals and institutions to restore accountability, even if it means challenging norms or taking extraordinary risk. The publication of the Pentagon Papers was more than a response to government misconduct. It was a reminder of what democracy demands from all of us: vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to truth.
From Congress, information about decision-making. It bears on the history of the last 25 years, how we got into Vietnam, what the recommendations were, what the decision-making and the responsibility was. If the president can really keep secret indefinitely, and at his own decision, essentially without appeal,